Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Creating Space podcast. My name is Olivia Lancashire, and as a part of my undergraduate research with the Lumen Prize at Elon University, I'm going to be conducting a series of interviews that will explore my current project, the intersection between Christian perspectives on hell and religious trauma. In this podcast series, I will be interviewing individuals from a range of expertise, including pastors, counselors, biblical scholars, and psychologists. In doing so, I hope to create a space for questions that a lot of people are too afraid to talk about. Today, I'm excited to welcome Ashley Buckner to the podcast. Ashley is a licensed marriage and family therapist based in Southern Utah and has been in practice for over 10 years. She works with a wide range of individuals, however, specializes in trauma, Mormon religious trauma, faith deconstruction, depression, and anxiety. Ashley is also trained in brain spotting, which is a tool used to help people regulate their nervous system. I'm so excited to dive into this conversation and learn from her work. Welcome, Ashley, to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Olivia. That was such a nice introduction. I'm excited to be here and just chat with you. I love the research that you're doing and everything you're conducting and diving into. I think it's such important work.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful that you're here. So to start out, can you just kind of share a little bit about your journey of becoming a therapist and how you started working with religious trauma and faith deconstruction?
Yeah, sure. So I'm currently living in Southern Utah, which is where I grew up, but I left Southern Utah when I was 18 and moved to California. I did my undergrad in sociology at Loyola Marymount University in LA, and then I moved to San Diego for graduate school to become a therapist, and that's where my journey started. So I started just working with at-risk youth, actually, and was super passionate about it and did that for 6.5 years. And my husband and I decided in 2018 to move to Utah. Just California is very expensive. Ended up coming to Utah. I started working in a residential facility here with adolescent girls, so I wasn't really working with the Utah population. And then I kind of took a break because I had kids and just like renegotiated my life and what I wanted to do in my career. And in 2022, I was trained in a form of therapy called brain spotting, which is exactly what Olivia said it is. It works with the nervous system to create regulation, to release trauma. It can also be used to enhance creativity. There's lots of ways brain spotting can be used, which is why I love it. And it was then that I decided, okay, I think I can open a therapy practice here in Southern Utah. So I was primarily doing telehealth sessions because I'm licensed in California and Utah. So I was primarily serving California via telehealth. And I decided to open a practice here in Utah. And when you do brain spotting sessions, you work directly with the nervous system, right? So a client comes in with any difficulty, any issue that they want to focus on. And I follow their nervous system. So I'm never dictating the session. I'm never deciding where it goes. And what started happening in my practice here in Southern Utah is there just continued to be implications of religious trauma in people's nervous system. So obviously I live in Utah. The predominant faith and culture here is the Mormon Church and the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints. And the influence and impact of that culture just continued to show up in my sessions with these clients in their nervous system over and over and over again. And that's what led me to specialize in Mormon religious trauma. I was a member of the faith. So I, like I said, grew up here, but I left when I was 20 years old and I had literally kind of wiped my hands of it. I'd moved on, wasn't intersecting it at all. And then I just have found to be a mental health practitioner in Utah and to be a sound mental health practitioner in Utah, we have to talk about the predominant culture, which is Mormonism, and that is impacting people's mental health on a nervous system level and creating a lot of trauma and distress.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you for sharing all of that. For those that don't know, can you kind of explain a little bit about what religious trauma is and how you perceive that?
Yeah, absolutely. So religious trauma, well, I think to understand religious trauma, we have to talk about the definition of trauma. So trauma is not what happens to us, it's how our body reacts to what happens to us, which is essentially what religious trauma is, right? So it's in the eye of the beholder. It's very subjective. What was distressful for one person in religion might not be distressful for the other. religious trauma can be a single event. So, like a spiritual abuse with a leader or something that happens just in one time in a religious space. Or I think religious trauma can be very complex. And what I mean by that is a lot of times people are born into a religion. So they're indoctrinated and programmed from a very young age when their brain is really young and neuroplastic. And so it can happen over time, right? And just like a distress in the body and not having the coping skills and the resources to navigate that distress can become traumatic for the nervous system. So, religious trauma is what the distress we feel in our body,
Yeah.
in the same way that any traumatic event can look. It just is different, right? It's the situation or the environment that's causing the trauma versus getting in a car accident or something like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I was wondering when you said that, it kind of made me think a little bit about protective factors and risk factors. Would you say that plays a role in religious trauma in the sense of like if two individuals had the same experience and but one had maybe more protective factors than the other, do you think it would manifest differently?
Absolutely. I think that is something that would come into play.
Mhm.
And I talk about this quite a bit with my clients, right? Being a human in general, the human experience is difficult and hard. It's full of distress. I mean, many of us experience traumatic events, right? And trauma is so subjective. So what is distressful for me is probably not distressful for you. And it's just how it is, right?
Yeah.
So that in and of itself is difficult. And then we're going to, on top of it, place a high control religion that's very demanding, that has a set of rules, that makes certain things conditional to get to heaven. And that intertwined with just the human experience is what makes it complex. And I think, right, some people grow up in a home and they don't have generational trauma. They have two very loving, attached parents, have a solid support system, right? So they're maybe not going to be impacted by a high control religion to the same degree as those that are struggling or
Yeah.
have some more of those risk factors. But I think it's important to keep in mind that I think one of the what's appealing about high control religion is that it is protective for vulnerable populations.
Yeah.
Right? So if you have a lot of trauma and distress, you're going to be attracted to a high control religious setting because it creates a lot of certainty
Yeah.
and safety and community, but it also has a lot of perpetuation of your underlying traumas. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it definitely does. I also, that's something I've thought a lot about, of just individuals that grow up with that lack of control might end up wanting to seek out environments that give them that sense of control. But what I've come to kind of see is that at the end of it all, it seems to kind of take away the control or the perceived control that was once there, because it is so high control and takes away that autonomy piece, which I think I've seen a lot just talking to individuals that either work with religious trauma or have experienced it. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then I also wanted to talk about, I know you said there's a lot of variability between how people experience religious trauma, but could you talk about some of the ways that it manifests in people just generally?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting, right? Because again, it's like this intersection of the human experience and then this high control religion. So a lot of times how it's showing up in people's nervous system it varies. It's subjective. But I could start with like a lot of perfectionism comes from a high control religion. So, right, that would be the focus of my session with a client. We're going to work on perfectionism, and it typically never stays there. What starts to come up in the nervous system is worthiness. Like, I'm not good enough. I have to follow all these rules in order to be good enough. And so perfection is a manifestation of the nervous system to deal with worthiness, right? And you've kind of talked about like the devil and the fear of being influenced by the devil and being unworthy to get to heaven, right? Based on that. And so how that's going to manifest can be like more fear based, or uncertainty is distressful for the client. And then what comes up for that is, for that client, is fear in the nervous system related to an entity like the devil. right? Like, oh my gosh, I'm struggling. I'm having these depressive symptoms because the devil is influencing me.
Mm.
Versus I'm just having these symptoms because I'm part of a setting that's created so much distress in my nervous system that depression is an adaptation of a way to cope with the distress. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that kind of sounds like maybe the client then internalizing um, kind of these doctrines as opposed to seeing it as a part of the system. Like in one of my classes, we talk a lot about kind of problematizing the system as opposed to the individual. And I think that's really relevant, or sounds really relevant in religious trauma too, because I think when we're talking about God and the devil and all these things that are outside of us, it becomes very personal as opposed to just a system or a set of doctrine. Or does that kind of seem?
Yes. No, you're spot on. And I think something to kind of point out, and just I'll speak to Mormon culture, right? So in Mormon culture, children are baptized at 8 years old, and they receive doctrine about what baptism means and how that's how they're going to, being a member of church, being a member of the Mormon church and getting baptized a member of the Mormon church is kind of like that first step in working towards exaltation. And then also, accepting Jesus, right? All of those messages. And the problem is at 8 years old, kids they're just doing what they think is right, but they don't really have the capacity to process, okay, well, now I'm baptized and my sins are washed away. So that's what they're told.
Yeah.
And then they go and make some choices like being mean to their sibling or lying or doing anything that a kid would do. And that can be very distressing for their nervous system because they've learned that now they're sinning and that's taking away their relationship from Jesus, God, whatever it be. And a lot of people push back, well, like the repentance process. Kids don't understand the repentance process. They're 8 years old, right? They don't even know what that means.
Yeah.
And so what happens is that just all gets programmed into their nervous system and sits there. They don't know what to do with it. They can't really talk about it because they're not going to have the language to talk about it until they're adults, right?
Yeah.
But the problem is for most adults that are in the system, it's hardwired in their DNA at this point. Like it's programmed in their being, and staying and continuing to be a part of the system, in my opinion, is a trauma response.
Yeah.
Because it's too distressing to think about it being harmful.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Do you feel like religious scrupulosity is something that you see in your practice?
Yes, so much. And again, that's another manifestation of the nervous system. So I see all of these things like scrupulosity, perfectionism, even depression, anxiety.
Yeah.
Our nervous system, when it's receiving certain messages that are distressful and we can't do anything about it, right? Especially as a little kid, we're not going to get up and leave church because our parents probably won't let us, and we are just doing what we are supposed to do. And then I think this kind of goes throughout our time or participation in a high control group. And so things are getting stuck in our being, and they have to find a way out. They have to find a way to escape. And that's what a scrupulosity is, right? Yeah. It's a way to keep yourself in check so you don't feel the distress of not following the rule, what it means to not follow the rules of the religion, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And do you feel like this concept of hell kind of plays a bigger role into the scrupulosity? Because from what I've observed, it seems like if you're constantly thinking about, yes, like your here and now experience, but then also an afterlife where there's potential to be tortured, it seems like that would almost elevate the need to keep your behavior in check. Does that kind of come up a lot?
Yeah, and I think it's a little bit different in the Mormon religion because the Mormon heaven is very complex and complicated, and there's layers to what's the highest level of heaven you can get in, and so they don't push hell quite as much as I would say mainstream Christianity because there's these tiers in heaven, and so the worst people can go to this bottom tier of heaven, but they don't get to be at the highest level of heaven where they get to be with their family forever, right? It's very complex and complicated, which as I'm talking to you, it's confusing. It's so confusing, right? So that's also impacting people's nervous system. And then you do have this element, if you are like me and you leave the Mormon church and you have your records removed, you don't even go to hell, you go to outer darkness. You don't even get a place in the afterlife because you have chosen to deny the truth, right? So imagine just like the toll that takes on people around their choices and their decisions. Like I, for a long time, was like, oh my gosh, I've done the ultimate sin.
Oh,
And I
yeah.
remember, and I didn't really think about that when I left, but when I was a kid growing up, a teenager, like, oh my gosh, if I think this is not real, or I don't believe in this religion, I'm committing the ultimate sin. That is
Right.
very distressing, right? Which I think applies to just Christianity in general. Like this
Absolutely.
fear of I'm not going to be in heaven, whatever heaven means based on the religion you're in. And if I don't do X, Y, and Z, I'm going to go to this other place, the scarier place. That's very coercive. You're not making choices from your own being. You're making choices that are a bit manipulated, in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. And one thing I've been thinking a lot about is this preoccupation with correct thinking. Someone that I listen to, Peter Enns, talks a lot about this. But when the basis of truth is on your ability to correctly think about a topic, that is so distressing. And it does place truth outside of yourself, and intuition and like gut feelings and all of those things are thrown out the window. And so, can you talk a little bit about the autonomy piece too, and how that shows up in your work and kind of how you go about healing those things with your clients?
Yeah, no, that's such a great question. And I think that also circles back to another question you asked about how is religious trauma showing up?
Yeah.
One way that religious trauma is showing up significantly in my practice is disembodiment, which is what we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
So it is too distressful to trust your own physical, emotional sensations because they might be influenced by the devil or they're wrong. They go against purity culture, right? So how do we as beings survive that? We get out of our body and we stop
Yeah.
listening to our body. We stop trusting those messages that are coming up. And I think that absolutely influences our autonomy and our ability to make choices that are coming from a place inside of us versus a place of fear and distress and anxiety. But religion, I think, it's much more complex because religion is like, oh, we're this loving entity and you're going to get all of these blessings and all of these promises if you follow what we ask you to do.
Yeah.
So people don't even realize that they're disembodied.
Mm.
Does that
Yeah.
make sense? So they because their trauma response was disembodiment and now they're prescribing to this religious belief, they're making those choices and they think they're making those choices and decisions.
Yeah.
Right? So they a lot of people I think will tell you they do have autonomy in high control religion, and I get super curious if that's even possible because to me by saying that, again, that's a trauma response. You are absolutely going to say that because what does it mean if you don't have autonomy in a high control religion?
Yeah. That's very true. And I guess because you're programmed to make decisions that are going to align with those doctrines, it doesn't feel like you never even really think about stepping outside of that until you get to the place where you kind of question and are maybe thinking, I need to get out of here. And then that feels very distressing, obviously. So it's not, then you might even get more out of your body from there. I'm not sure, but
No, absolutely. I think it just becomes this like perpetual problem that happens. And I would say that's what I work with a lot of clients on because brain spotting is a body-based approach.
yeah.
So imagine if I'm working with a population that's very disembodied, so much of our foundational work is helping them get back into their body and get to know their physical sensations and the way their emotions are showing up in their nervous system, which is very difficult to do when you've spent half your life being disembodied.
Absolutely. Would you say it's a concern of clients becoming re-traumatized? Like, how do you kind of work with brain spotting? Do you start with different therapeutic approaches and work your way there, or how do you kind of go about that?
So actually, and why I love brain spotting, and so I'm a certified brain spotting practitioner. And what that means is that I've done subsequent trainings, I receive consultation, and I'm constantly evaluating the work and services I'm providing with the supervisor. And so there's a whole realm of brain spotting that's called like high acuity brain spotting. And high acuity means like clients that have pretty significant levels of distress in their nervous system, right? They've experienced complex or developmental trauma. And so I can start brain spotting very, very soft, where we don't even address the trauma until the client is ready to address the trauma. Does that make sense? And
Yeah.
so that can look different for every person, just as we're saying, like trauma is so subjective and people's responses are so subjective, but I get to go in very gently.
Yeah.
And sometimes my like first initial, I mean, I have one client that we've been doing like 9 months of resourcing brain spotting work where they find a place in their nervous system that feels grounded,
Yeah.
right? And just creating that sense of groundedness in their nervous system allows them to work through some of the trauma without actually ever like having to go head on at it. And that is the power of brain spotting. Brain spotting work can start immediately without having to go into full activation thinking of the most traumatic thing that's happened in your life.
Got it. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And then, just for my clarification, how would you differentiate EMDR and brain spotting? Because I kind of overlap those often in my head, but I know they're different.
No, I get this question a lot, and I'm just going to be really transparent. I'm not an EMDR therapist, and so I can't really speak to what EMDR is. I know some things, obviously. So EMDR is done in movement, right? Rapid eye movement, and brain spotting is done in stillness. So
Interesting.
clients hold a fixed eye position. And I would say EMDR, from what I know, is very directive. Like it has like a pretty, like, this is how you do it, this is how you implement it. Brain spotting is very intuitive and very much about my attunement to my clients. So again, we start with a topic, I hold that fixed eye position, and then their nervous system goes wherever it goes, and I follow them and we go wherever it needs to go. And sometimes it's too much, and so we have to pivot to one of those resource spots that I talked about, and that's where we go from there. But yeah, brain spotting is much more just like, I would say, fluid and intuitive and
Okay.
kind of really attuning to what's happening in the nervous system. And my understanding is that EMDR is not that. And I've had a lot of clients who were previously EMDR clients that do brain spotting, and they report that brain spotting just gets deeper,
Yeah.
right? Because of the movement in EMDR, it's very powerful. And I've heard incredible things about EMDR. I've never done it personally. But you're constantly in movement, right?
Yeah.
Metaphorically. And brain spotting, I'm going to hold this fixed eye position for you, and you're going to just stay right there. And that just allows you to access this part of your brain, this like subcortical, subconscious part of your brain where all of your distress is stored, and it can just allow for this really big process. So brain spotting is going to happen in waves where we have these intense activation waves and they eventually crash. When we experience trauma, a lot of times those waves don't happen because we have to cut them off, or they're too distressing, or we get stuck in freeze or fawn, right? And so brain spotting is turning on our nervous system to work how it's supposed to. So in a brain spotting session, it'll start, it'll have a huge wave, and then it'll come down, and then another wave and another wave. And I'm following my clients until we like have no waves, until that has released from their nervous system. And sometimes that happens in one session, and sometimes it's a lot. It just depends on the complexity of the trauma. I don't know if that makes sense or answers your question.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, and then switching gears a little bit, can you talk about, I guess, because religious trauma is something, there's a huge need for therapists working with religious trauma. What is something that you would want people to know about religious trauma that isn't widely known?
I mean, the first thing that comes up for me is that it's real.
Yeah.
I think that there's this whole, it's becoming more talked about and more researched, and there's more information about religious trauma. I also think that because it's, and I get this pushback all the time because I talk very openly about Mormon religious trauma.
Yeah.
And because most religion, especially the Mormon church, is like, we believe in families forever, and we're loving, and God loves you and Jesus loves you. It's like, it can't traumatize you. It can't cause you difficulties. It's the people that are causing the difficulties, not the doctrine. And I think, I want to say, I know religious doctrine can cause harm and trauma. I have seen it countless times in my sessions, right? Even just our conversation about heaven and hell, learning about hell can be traumatic and distressing for your nervous system. So that's my message. Religious trauma is real. And if you are curious about, have I experienced religious trauma? I would invite you to look into that. I just read this really incredible book called When Religion Hurts You.
Yes, Laura Anderson, right?
Yes. Laura Anderson, I follow her on social media. She is incredible. And I think that book really encapsulates what religious trauma and harm looks like, right? So it's interesting because my expertise, I wasn't studying religious trauma. I was a
Yeah,
brain spotting practitioner. I work with trauma, I work with the nervous system. And I'm like, what is this trauma that's showing up? So
yeah,
since I've been working with it, I'm like doing all of my increasing my knowledge and understanding of religious trauma. It's like this backdoor approach where I am seeing what religious trauma actually looks like in the nervous system. And I don't always have the language to say what it is. And so then I'm reading Dr. Laura Anderson's work, and I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, that's exactly what I'm seeing. So it's a
yeah,
fascinating process to do, right? To specialize, come into this specialty from a place of just what's showing up in people's nervous system.
yeah, absolutely. That's awesome. And then you touched on this a little bit, but can you talk about? I feel like cultural competence is going to be very necessary for therapists working with religious trauma. So, for any therapist that might not have grown up in a religious setting or with understanding of how high control religion kind of functions, can you share maybe, I guess, directions they should go to learn more about it, or something that you think therapists should know when working with religious trauma?
Yeah, I think it's really about being curious and open to learning about the religion in which your client comes from. And I think that as therapists, really like your client is the expert too, and their
Yeah.
lived experience in the religion is very real. I obviously think, doing your own personal research and understanding of a religion is very important, and understanding the culture. And again, that I knew the culture because I grew up as a Mormon,
Yeah.
right? So it serves me very well in doing this work. And I had done a lot of deconstruction prior to ever working with the nervous system, right? So my own trauma is not showing up, right? I've already worked through a lot of that. So I think it's just being really cognizant of that as a therapist, like, where are you at? And I get this question so much, like, can I work with a therapist that one is part of the religion that's harmed me, or the therapist that doesn't understand the religion? And my answer is yes. I think if that therapist is competent, addressing their bias, doing trainings, right? It
Yeah.
doesn't really matter what their religion is. They have the tools and resources to support you. And if they don't, right? If a therapist is like, I'm not the right fit for you, a competent therapist will tell you as a client.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Um, and then lastly, I kind of wanted to talk about, just for anyone struggling with the concept of hell specifically, what would kind of be your piece of advice that you would offer for that person as they're kind of going down this journey of maybe deconstructing or leaving the faith?
Yeah. I mean, can you expand a little bit about what that struggle would look like? Like, what does
Yeah.
that struggle look like? Give me a little more context.
Yeah. Well, I think kind of what I'm thinking is, if someone either from a young age or coming in later in life was taught about this idea of eternal torment and had it just sitting with them, and I guess it would be manifesting in just anxiety about the afterlife, what's to come, what they're believing now, kind of that preoccupation with correct thinking, um, perfectionism, like you said, just kind of not feeling safe, really, I think is what I'm kind of getting at. How do you get back into your body, like you were talking about, and start to feel safe with uncertainty, I guess?
Yeah, I would invite anyone struggling to consider a body-based approach to therapy. Um, Also, too, that's not always accessible,
Yeah.
right? And so I think it's a lot of times about being curious and taking a moment to kind of step back and be aware of, is this belief mine, or is this belief outside of me? Has someone told me this, right? Is this my voice or someone else's voice? And
Yeah.
getting really curious about that. And then when you have anxiety about the afterlife, you feel uncertain, you're doing some of those scrupulous behaviors, you're engaging in like perfectionism, noticing, and then kind of taking a bird's eye view and saying, it makes sense that I'm doing this.
Yeah.
It makes sense that this is happening for me because hell is really, really scary. And so it makes sense I would be doing all of these things to avoid hell. And it's just really about softening your perception of the behaviors that you have. A lot of times we feel that fear, we feel that anxiety, and we want to fight it. We want to run from it because it's like distressing and
Yeah.
dysregulating. And all that fight does is make it stronger in our being.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's softening. I'm not saying you need to be BFFs with your anxiety, but hating your anxiety is not going to allow you to work with it, allow you to see it for what it is, because in my opinion, it's protective. All
Yeah.
of those behaviors you just mentioned are all protective. They're trying to protect you from this initial or like long-term distress trauma that's created by thinking about eternal torment, right? So that is a distressing thing to learn about, and our body is remarkable. Our nervous system is remarkable to find a way to adapt and work with that. So I think curiosity, openness, trying to zoom out to see those things for what they are
Yeah.
and realize that you were taught to believe them versus them being you. So kind of separating yourself.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that's really interesting. One of the goals with my research is kind of to get an understanding of all of the differing perspectives, because I think when I was really in the thick of it and only hearing this one perspective of hell, that was giving me so much anxiety. But when I stepped back, like you said, and kind of zoomed out, I started to realize how many perspectives are out there and how many types of Christians there are. And, obviously this will look different for everyone because some people need to completely step away. But it was very helpful to just get curious and to see, oh, there's so many different ways I can think about this, and that doesn't have to feel unsafe. Like there's other people thinking like this too. And so that was really, really helpful. So I love that advice.
Yeah. And I think I think it's really about building your distress tolerance for uncertainty, because life is very uncertain.
Yeah.
And that's what's also very appealing about religion is
Yeah.
it offers certainty and one right way to live. And that's why when you step away or you're evaluating your religious trauma, you feel distress.
Yeah.
And so it's about just increasing your tolerance for uncertainty. And I think there's a lot of skills to practice that. I mean, just grounding exercises and trying to focus on being present in the moment.
Yeah.
Like what can you see, taste, touch, smell? Like how can you come to the moment and finding things that create meaning for you that are just generated from your own being. So what gives you meaning? What do you enjoy? And that doesn't have to have anything to do with religion, but that can also really help you find a sense of ease with uncertainty.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. Well, those are all the questions I have for you, but thank you so much for sharing all of this. It was so helpful, and I know that anyone listening is going to find it extremely helpful too. So yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Olivia. I love chatting about this. I love the work you're doing, and I'm excited to see where you go.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.